So we want to get started today with the first panel. We want to thank you all again for coming today to helping us celebrate the 25th anniversary of the American Cultures program here at Cal. By way of introduction, my name is Bianca Suarez, and I'm a current doctoral student here in the School of Education. I have many research interests, but my dissertation work, the work I'm getting ready to go and start, takes me back to my hometown. It's a little place you may have heard about it. It's called Detroit, and my work is based around doing oral history projects with members of the community around educational visions. So I'm interested in how do we understand how different conceptions of education are arrived at through people's social processes and interactions with institutions, be it structural ones or be it ideological ones like racism. And so that's kind of like the work I'm most interested in as a graduate of the school system there in Detroit. So the questions that orient today's symposium have been recurring in my own process of research development. There have been clear moments for me when I have questioned the ability of institution-based research to serve any function other than the needs of elites to reproduce themselves. At the same time, I also recognize that sometimes we need research in order to push an action agenda further. So these are kind of the tension of where I see myself, and I think these are the tensions we're going to talk about today and how we work and consider them in the process of arriving at our research agendas. So in an effort to address this tension, we are joined today by 5 panelists who represent collaborative teams of folks involved in research justice work. The intention of the panel is to provide a space to explore the thought processes behind how people have crafted or come to their research agendas and our action agendas with research components. While this panel title includes an assertion of highly effective examples of community-engaged research, the way in which we might think about effective being deployed is to think about how the effective is measured by how we honor that relationship throughout the research process and how that relationship takes priority over all other kinds of aims. So then this is an opportunity to pause and consider the questions and tensions that are faced in imagining a research project that has a vision beyond being published. So before we begin, just a few organizing details. For the first conversation, we provided the panelists with a list of questions to consider, but by all means, you can talk about whatever you'd like to. Sometimes there's better questions that come out of these panels. The conversation will encourage us to think about the time before research begins, when decision-making happens, when we think about the possibility and limits of research, when we partner with communities and local organizations to craft projects, or when community partners offer gentle, sometimes not so gentle, reminders that institutions need to honor their own missions. And we'll think aloud about what happens when projects end. I think everyone a part of today's event deeply understands that there is no checklist that must be applied if a project is to meet community engaged or justice standards, but perhaps there is a shared orientation, a shared set of principles, and hopefully this conversation will help us to think aloud about that and to think together. So what I'd like to do is invite each panelist to perhaps spend some time giving a brief introduction to who they are, the kind of collaborative research they're a part of, and then we'll move into the first set of questions that I'll read aloud. There's also this thing called buzz questions that I've been asked to kind of integrate throughout, where I'll ask a question that we'll think about together, but we also want to encourage you all to think about together. So it's kind of like thinking really actively together in this moment. So we want to encourage us to do that today. So yeah, we just want to move on to my left, my immediate left.
Hi, I'm Mary Louise Frampton, and I want to start by acknowledging a tension right here today, and that is that those of us are sitting up here on a stage, and that's not an easy way to have a conversation with the rest of you. So we're in an institution that requires us apparently to be up on the stage in order to be recorded, but we were all saying that this is making us very uncomfortable that we are up here. I teach at the law school here at UC Berkeley, and for all of my classes, I insist that they be in a room where I can sit around a round table with my students, where I am not somehow elevated and lecturing to them. And it's different. That's a different requirement than most professors at the law school have. And it's hard for them to accommodate me because most of the classrooms, the professors are sitting up here, right? And I think that that's very counter to what we're talking about today. So acknowledging that, so I'm the faculty director at the Henderson Center for Social Justice at the law school, and we are training the next generation of public interest lawyers and doing community engaged research on race and poverty. Much of our research is right here in this area. We're looking at, for example, trying to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline by the use of restorative justice in schools and juvenile justice institutions. And I see some of my fabulous colleagues here from the Central Valley, where they're doing a lot of community-engaged research. But what I actually wanted to talk about today was a research project that I'm engaged in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is it's really an outlying kind of project, lots of difficulties, and that's why I wanted to bring it here today, to talk about the challenges. I am sort of an outlier as well. I'm really old looking at my other panelists here. I was a civil rights lawyer, battling injustice in courtrooms for 30 years before I came to UC Berkeley 14 years ago now. So my approach is really not so much as a researcher, but as an advocate. And when I think about what an effective research project is, it isn't whether the result of the research is going to be published in a premier journal, or even whether it's maybe going to advance knowledge a little bit in my fields. It's really about whether it's going to have an effect or an impact out in the real world. That's what matters to me. And again, that's a tension between the values of academia and the values of what I call the real world. So I think I think that's enough for now.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dawn Phillips, and I'm the program co-director at Causa Justa, Just Cause. And I'm actually, when you look at me, you should see two people. Zoe's actually co-presenting with me. She's going to introduce herself in a minute, but we were research partners on the project that we're here to talk about this morning. So Causa Justa is a community-based organization that does housing and immigrant justice work here in the Bay Area. We work primarily in Oakland and San Francisco. And this is the introduction section. So a little bit about what the project was that we're here to talk specifically about. But along with the Alameda County Public Health Department, we produced a report around gentrification and development in the Bay Area. It's a understudied, under-discussed topic. No, just kidding. It's a very current, very popular topic, as people know, and we had some specific reasons which we can talk more about as we get into the questions, what motivated the production of the report and the study that we did. Actually, Luis Flores, Luis, where are you? Luis over there also was an author with Zoe and myself on the report, so he also gets credit. But we figured 3 was overkill. So a few things I would say in terms of introduction. Firstly, me, myself, I come to the panel in this conversation, primarily my perspective is as an organizer. So actually, I think it's been, it's probably been like almost 15, maybe 18 years since I've sat at a table, UC Berkeley table like this, and never have I had a microphone on me in this context. So I'm an organizer. I've been organizing here in the Bay Area since like the mid 90s around like various social justice issues, homelessness issues, housing issues, environmental justice issues, and the the relationship in my mind between organizing and research is actually a very critical one. In line with kind of what Mary was saying, I think that that research has to be about the work that's happening on the ground. I've been having some debates actually with Louise lately about how important research is. So I'm not one of those organizers who think that like if it doesn't come from the streets, it has no validity. Actually, the longer I organize, the more I come to understand that actually theory, frameworks, data have central, critical place and a role to play in terms of organizing and supporting mass work and mass movement. Yes, there's a lot to say about where those research questions originate from, who's kind of driving the research work. All those are certainly very valid questions, but as an organizer, I can tell you there is no way to do scaled and effective organizing and advocacy without really deeply understanding research, theories, and frameworks. So there has to be a really close dialectic and relationship between these two. And I think that also there's really a role to play that organizers and work that is happening in communities, quote unquote, on the ground, has to inform in terms of academia. Because I'll tell you, part of, to kind of flip what Mary said, part of our interest in terms of producing this type of work is that we actually want to influence academics. We think we have something to teach. We think we have something to say. We think that actually the kind of theory that comes from the work is actually very, very credible and very, very necessary to contribute to the kind of broader kind of framework, the kind of broader understanding on different questions, different issues, et cetera. So as long as there's an equal and equally privileged understanding of where knowledge gets produced, how it's getting produced, and that in fact they can be in very meaningful relationship and dialogue with each other, then I think we're all in the right place, right? So.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Zoe Levitt, and I work at the Alameda County Public Health Department, as Don said. And I work as part of an initiative called Place Matters, which is a local policy initiative based at the health department. It's part of a national initiative sponsored by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And we basically work on health analysis, policy analysis, and data analysis to support local policy change related to what we call the social determinants of health. So we work in 5 issue areas, including land use and transportation, housing, economics, education, and criminal justice. So I'm very lucky personally to work at a public agency that has this sort of institutional history of working on local policy change and policy advocacy, and specifically partnering with community organizations to advance community-driven local policy change. So this partnership, I also want to say, was built on a history of partnership with Causa Justa Just Cause. Before I came on, we had worked with Causa Justa on a report on foreclosure and the public health impacts of the foreclosure crisis, specifically in Oakland. And we also have, as part of our housing work group, we work with a lot of community-based organizations, including Causa Justa. So this is something that we'd had a history of partnership with, and really a relationship to build on, which I think is really key, which we'll talk about probably later on with some of the questions. I think one thing that is really important that I feel lucky to have in my agency or where I work, that's probably a bit unusual, is we do have an awareness and a commitment to sharing our institutional power as a public agency and sharing that and lending that with community-based organizations. And I think it's really important when you think about there's different kinds of power that groups bring to a research process. And so we think about access to information and resources, as well as our ability to connect with other public agencies and to move public agencies on certain policies that we think are very important for health and for health equity. So I think with that, I will leave it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Shamia Sandles, and I work with Project EAT, which is a nutrition education program of Alameda County Office of Education. I'm a youth development specialist, and so what that means is I create opportunities for youth who engage with us through internships and other classroom and curricula that we use to go out into the community and become peer mentors, peer educators. We do a lot of work with community gardens, and other community-based organizations in southern Alameda County, but I'm going to talk about a youth-led participatory action research project that we were fortunate enough to be funded to research how to create career pathway programs in Hayward and San Leandro. And so we took a very grassroots method towards it. I guess I'll get into that later. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'll just pass it.
Okay. Thanks. My name's Emily Marquez, and I am a staff scientist at Pesticide Action Network. I'll just explain what we are. So PAN North America was founded in 1982 in Malaysia, and we're part of an international network. PAN North America works on ag policy reform through the issues of corporate control of the agricultural, or of how agriculture is done in this country, and also undue corporate influence over the regulatory process of chemicals registration. So my training is as a biologist, and I work with PAN community organizers, training people to use what we call the drift catcher right now in Minnesota and Iowa. But this project, this model as it stands, has actually been around since at least 2002 when the drift catcher was invented by another colleague, Susan Kegley. So what we do with the drift catcher is work to monitor pesticide drift in the air, and that provides some hard evidence of something that can be recognized qualitatively. So a community member who lives in an area where they're subject to pesticide drift might say, I smell something, I feel sick, but by the time an inspector comes to document that, then that evidence is gone. Mm-hmm. So this provides hard evidence, and we present that evidence in a technical report so that it's credible, scientifically sound, but we also very much want people from the communities to be spokespeople and advocates for themselves.
Thank you so much. Well, there's a wealth of just knowledge and experience on this panel, so I'm going to move right into the first question, which is really just offered as a way to provide a space to think reflectively about how folks arrived at the project, the thought process or the community organizing process that was already ongoing that led itself to ask kind of research questions that needed clarification. So that's the question. So what was the thought or community organizing process that shaped the research project? Why might have this been the right kind of intervention for that specific moment in that project or the timeline of the organizing action? Even thinking about context-specific considerations that might have informed the research project. And anyone can start.
Oh, I can start. I'm sorry. I didn't hear that. Okay. Well, like I said before, the part of it is because, or part of the reason for establishing this was Susan, who created the drift catcher in its current form, wanted some chance to give hard evidence of the problem of pesticide drift. And I think one of the biggest things that the data that we collect with the drift catcher calls attention to is, the data raised the question, are the current standards, are the regulations that are supposed to protect people from pesticide exposures, are those actually doing the job of really appropriately protecting people? And I'll just give you the answer. The answer is no for people who are living in frontline communities. And one of the biggest problems here is, let's say, if you have a pesticide label, they have these kind of vague, well, I think vague instructions saying, you can't apply a pesticide or spray a pesticide at the time when winds are over X miles per hour. And yet the problem with that is the wind changes when you're applying pesticides throughout that time. And also there's this very misguided idea that maybe you could control every aspect that would actually result in pesticide drift, when in fact, even if the applicator is doing everything according to the label and using the right nozzles and using all the things that go into that, it does not control every problem that could occur. And we've seen this again and again. So I think, in this case, what we do with the monitoring is we monitor in places where people live, so that it's not just the edge of a field. So we say, well, these levels were taken in someone's backyard or by their children's play set, and that really hits home. People are being threatened in their own homes. Some people actually leave their homes when they know pesticides are being applied because it's such a problem. So those are some of one of the most important requirements for us to do an air monitoring project is people unfortunately have to live close to a pesticide application in order to do monitoring and to participate in this. Thanks.
I can go next. I got my train of thought back. And so Alameda County Office of Education decided that they wanted to create career pathway programs that guide students in our high schools and our continuation high schools into fields of public health service and through higher education. And so we were funded through the Public Health Initiative to do some grassroots research around what a career pathway program should look like in our community. And since we already facilitate a number of youth internships in several high schools and about 4 school districts, we decided that the youth were the best people to hire as researchers for this kind of reconnaissance project that we were engaged in. And so we went through our internships and kind of handpicked youth that have shown a strong commitment to their community, to our work, and to just being involved in social justice projects. And so we weren't looking for straight A students or students that showed a really high aptitude to research, but just students that seemed like they really wanted to be involved. And so we took 10 students and brainstormed a list of places that we felt we could learn from. So what are places that your friends have been part of, that you've heard on television, anything that you would like to learn more about so we can bring this into our own community. And we came up with a list of about a dozen places in 4 different cities. And so we traveled to LA, Chicago, New York City, and Philadelphia with about 3 or 4 students with us every time. And since these students, like I said, weren't or straight A students, students that were, kind of scholarship bound, we didn't rely on traditional research methods. So in collecting data, we used a lot of photography, a lot of voice audio recordings, so that the information was of qualitative of nature, but we were still able to capture a lot of data about what made these programs appealing to the youth in their community and things that we could bring back in Alameda County. So all the youth, at the end of every project, they took their data and created a Prezi. I don't know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Prezi, but it's a really interactive, highly individualized platform for young people who may not be accustomed to writing things down or sharing their information written could still share all their data and put it online. So all our collaborative partners were able to access this data. And so when we did eventually pair up with a consulting firm, Be the Change, they had access to that information about what the youth in our community wanted to see in their career pathway programs. So that's how we knew research was the best intervention.
So I'm just going to share a few thoughts, but I want to point out, actually, this particular project was initiated by Causa Justa Just Cause, and they asked us for particular research assistance and role in this. But so I think that's one strong piece of it, that it really was led and driven by a community-based organization, and so this was really grounded in the organizing work and goals of this issue. On the public health side, I think, so one thing in the Place Matters initiative, we have a lot of research and data, and we focus a lot on the importance of, obviously, of place for health, and specifically the social, economic, and physical environment, and how all of those factors really affect people's health. And so we focus a lot on policies that really shape people's environments. So this project was an important opportunity for us to try to better understand what happens to people's health when they are displaced from their home or uprooted from home, and particularly in a context where there is a strong, I think, a strong trend or belief in, particularly in some of the housing policy, community development world, that around, the deconcentration of poverty, where moving people is necessarily good for health. And we wanted to really explore, is that the case? And actually what are the health consequences when people are moved, particularly around the social fabric and community ties, community networks, and those kinds of things. So when people are displaced from their longtime neighborhoods, we wanted to really explore and document what the health impacts were.
Were those impacts good?
Those impacts were not good, no. Yes. We can share, there's pages and pages around the negative health consequences, around everything from financial costs to direct psychological impacts on people's mental health and well-being. People lose investments made in a home or job, as well as, or a business. And there's a lot of consequences when communities themselves are scattered. That dilutes political power. It disrupts people's access to social support that's so necessary for everyday health and well-being. And we even found some evidence that when people move, they're not always moving to places that are better for their health. Even, when people are relocating, sometimes they might be unfamiliar with the health or social services in their new neighborhood. And so there's all kinds of ways that displacement is very detrimental to health and well-being at the individual and the community level. But I want to let Dawn talk a bit about the sort of motivation for this particular project.
What I like about research is that it helps prove everything that we think is right. So anyone who does research should bear that in mind. That's really the most important thing. I'm only partly kidding. So around this project in particular, there were a couple of reasons why we felt actually doing this type of research and producing this type of report was important. Firstly, around the question of gentrification, we as an organization have over 20 years of history doing housing, community planning, neighborhood development work in Oakland and San Francisco. So there's a tremendous amount of kind of historic and depth of expertise that the organization as a whole has. We really felt like there was one of the things that serves as a real detriment to kind of advancing some of the things that we feel like need to happen around housing and displacement and community development is that there is this, in our opinion, a purposeful obscuring of actually what gentrification is as a socio-political economic process. So for us, what we thought that we wanted and needed to do was to actually intervene and actually make a contribution to clarifying theoretically and as a framework of analysis actually what gentrification was. So you had so what's out there, as many of you probably know, is a set of academic contribution that is fairly clear, even though politically that clarity can run a gamut in terms of our level of agreement in terms of what the definition is. The academic literature certainly is very clear in terms of trying to define what it is. And then when you move away from the academic and you go into the realm of public policy, which we operate a lot in, and you look into the realm of public discourse, in those two realms, you find that actually the either purposeful or unintentional obscuring of the meaning of gentrification and what it is as a process is actually one of the key reasons why we're having such a hard time in the Bay Area to actually deal with some of the root causes and deal with some of the impacts that Zoe was talking about. So for us, actually feeling quite strongly that we actually, from our work on the ground, had something to say that would speak to actually clarifying the definition and actually saying what it was. So the second thing we wanted to do is we actually felt like other folks have said before me, that actually the experiences of people who are being impacted by gentrification actually are a credible source of concern. So that yes, while data and data analysis and policy analysis is really important, our feeling was that, for someone who lives in their neighborhood for 30 or 40 years, if they have a perception of a problem, we think that that's legitimate. So one thing that's in the report is that we talked to tens of people who have lived in their neighborhoods, varying lengths of time with varying types of housing conditions, various relationships to the problem. And we said it's actually really important that we introduce as credible source and as credible arguments people's experience into the discussion and dialogue and debate around gentrification and community development. The third thing is that because we actually, so much of our work is about actually shifting policy, then the partnership with the Public Health Department actually is necessary because, you actually need to be able to present concrete alternatives. You actually need to be able to make policy arguments. But the idea is that these things have to work in concert and they have to work together. And I think part of what Zoe was talking about is that our sense of it is that none of these pieces are more important than any other. And also then in terms of the way we organize the work being done, the Public Health Department essentially brought the data analysis and policy expertise, and it was actually our organization that did the theoretical framework, provided the actual analytical framework and basis for the report, and essentially were responsible for all the kind of political and policy assertions that are in the report, which I think some people in other rooms, not this one, would think that was a little bit of a flip. So I would say that those are the kind of key interventions that we were making in terms of the policy realm and in terms of the data and research realm. I want to just talk for a minute because I'm hoping that there are folks in the audience who actually either have a history with organizing or are currently organizing. I want to just speak to this question from an organizer perspective for a second. I think that in this country, community organizing and advocacy work is famously anti-intellectual and anti-theoretical. One of the successful interventions that what some people refer to as the kind of Alinsky model of organizing is that Alinsky very successfully argued and then proceeded to impact several decades worth of and generations of organizers into being at worst fearful of theory and intellectual activity, and at best indifferent to it, and really hurt the field of organizing significantly because it basically created this impenetrable divide between intellectual work, theoretical work, and community and mass work, right? And this is something that, those of us here who are organizers and want to be organizers, we have to break this, we have to break that barrier down. We have to understand that knowledge and theory comes from work, right? And that we as organizers need to pull back, be able to sit down, articulate our thoughts, write it down, sharpen it, actually be able to talk about it in a theoretically sound way, while at the same time we have to understand that, it's not just academics and intellectuals who produce knowledge, that actually people and organizers produce knowledge. So anyway, so let's just have this be a very complex conversation because I think that, here in the United States especially, this type of activity is not seen to be the work of organizers. And for all the organizers out there, I just want to clarify for us, this is absolutely our work, is to produce theory, clarify theory, and make knowledge as well. So.
I couldn't agree more. So there were really several motivating factors for the Greensboro project. The first came from the university itself, from myself as an academic. I teach restorative justice. I'm constantly thinking about better tools to advance racial justice than litigation. Based on my long experience in the courtroom, I think that's not an effective way of advancing racial justice and racial healing, except in limited situations. We still need it, but it's not really moving society forward in a way I think we need to go. So I'm very interested in restorative justice as a racial justice tool. And one form of restorative justice is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You think about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the most prominent Truth and Reconciliation process in this country took place in Greensboro, which is the real epicenter of the sit-in movement from the civil rights era. And so in my restorative justice class, I teach about the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I, assign the scholarship on this that says how successful it was. But most of that scholarship is very abstract and academic, or it's done by people who essentially parachuted in. And the people that I knew in Greensboro were telling me, well, that scholarship is not very accurate. So I really wanted to see for myself and for my students, has this had an impact? Did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have an impact? At the same time, as I was working with community organizers in Oakland, they were saying to me, we're thinking about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Oakland. Do you think that's a good idea? If we use restorative justice in a Truth and Reconciliation process, what do you think? And I said, well, the scholarship on the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission is pretty good, but I'm skeptical, even though I'm a restorative justice advocate. So my organizing allies said, well, would you ever think about going to Greensboro and finding out what the actual impact of that has been? So, I have this, academic question, which comes from my activist days, and then my partners in Oakland are saying, please, this is going to be helpful for us. So that's what motivated this project. And I thought, well, what's the best way of finding out whether something has had an impact? Well, by asking people, right? And because I'm not a member of that community, I have to think about doing this in a way that is going to elicit trust and confidence. So I'm thinking about your oral history projects. So I thought, well, what about an oral history project that is all about the residents of Greensboro from all the different areas of the city, talking about what they think the impact of the commission was on the culture and the climate of Greensboro and on their lives. And just use this oral history process to amplify their voices. So I thought, all right, I'm going to use this oral history project to find out the answers to these questions we have. But then there's the problem, I'm 3,000 miles away, right? And yes, I know people in Greensboro who have all different views on the commission, but I'm still an outsider. So I need to go and live there for a while and become part of that community so that people see me not just as a researcher and somebody, this white woman, old white woman from UC Berkeley, but I actually come to Greensboro and I become part of that community. That's sort of a problem when you have a full-time teaching load here. So I took a semester off and I went to live in Greensboro. And I just started talking to people. I thought it would be important to have some local affiliation, so I became a visiting scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is an hour away. I thought it would be important to partner fairly quickly with a local social justice organization, and to have both that tie and to have funding that originated from North Carolina. I thought those things would be very important in moving forward on this project. So I was trying to really follow PAR principles of what's necessary to be working with the community. So all of my assumptions were incorrect. And so that'll be the answer to the next question.
All right. So this, I think what I'm gonna do right now is like two things. First, I just wanna say there are some note cards on your tables if you want to ask a question, because we're probably gonna move to that in the next like 10 minutes so we have time to do the interaction before lunch, but I'm sure if we go over a little bit, it's all good. A little bit, okay, thumbs up, all right, I like that. But they were just, I think I wanna do like a buzz question just because a lot just happened, and I think that some of like the dominant tensions and themes that people in this space kind of think about oftentimes alone just came out. And I think it's a good opportunity to think about these things together. And it goes back to kind of the opening icebreaker of like how we enter matters, right? And how we enter can really inform how we approach projects and the kinds of considerations we make, and how we understand that none of these different pieces of the puzzle are greater than the whole. And the whole, sometimes that becomes a way to understand what is effective. Right, and so I want to pose that as a question. I want to pose a question that we can like think about directly on how does personal biography inform research considerations? You know, how did you think about your positionality in relationship to the project? Did you discuss this openly within the research timeline? Like, what did that look like when you were interacting with youth or with the community in North Carolina? And to think about for those, the rest of the community here, to think about even that relationship, you know, for myself, because I think I've done a lot of work for not research purposes because of this tension I have with the idea of research. And sometimes I think about it like, what's a nice word like research sitting next to a word like justice, right? And can that sit together, right? Or like my homie Mike Castaneda just said, like one of his students is like, I'm not sure if those are reconcilable, right? And so that's a question I want to pose to you all. Maybe take, you know, a couple minutes to sit with that and maybe speak to a new homie you just met. And then we'll come back to the panelists and see if folks want to offer something on that. Cool? Okay. I know that was a lot. Sorry about that. Just got really excited.
Well, and
Sorry, I did not know you before this moment.
yeah.
So like you did about
Justice, yeah. And your comment that research is confirming what I would say confirms what we already know.
Yeah.
It's really duh. I mean, but people don't believe it, or it's
Yeah.
not valid unless we see it in research.
Right.
So I feel as if 90% of the research that I do, or that the Hendersons
Sometimes we don't get a
is
chance to talk about that.
we already know what.
And so I guess that's,
we just have to show you.
I guess that's, you know, my question for those of us who enter maybe as an organizer, like how did you think about how this is related to advancing a larger project? And even, was that a tension that community partners brought up in the case of that?
Yep.
So that was just like, but it got me thinking, because it's like a lot of, I think like a lot from a student perspective, a lot of my students like, often they're like, I don't know. And as we get more students of like color from these communities that have been over-researched and underserved, we don't want to do that, you know? So it's just, you know, just to think about like, was that a factor that informed considerations we make?
That's not
in the field
until we have the Henderson Center come in, and the public health department come in and say,
I think it's like, it's interesting that
Even though on a basic
You can tell it?
human level,
Yeah, I can tell. Just from when I was in
how could we not know the impact on
people who have lived in that neighborhood. That's their home, for God's sake, right? So it's frustrating to me that so much research has to be done to prove what we already know. And there's so much that we don't know.
It's less about.
Like, all right, so we know how hard this is, and so what do we do? So how can the research then create the solutions? All right, we know how hard this is on people. Okay, so you've got an area that's now economically depressed, and people don't have jobs.
All right. I'm glad it generated some conversation at the tables. We can continue over lunch. And I'm moving my seat just because it's really hard not to see your faces. So I was like, I feel really uncomfortable, and I know I'm like further away, but I get to see you. And so in that sense, I feel closer. So bear with me. So I was going to kick it over to Zoe because she started to share a story about her interaction in the research process and how her own biography kind of like shaped the intervention she sought to make through this specific partnership.
So yeah, I was just sharing that when I was a student as an undergrad in academia, like 7 years ago or so, my senior research project was focused on urban renewal and displacement in the Fillmore in San Francisco, and so I basically went out. I had this like project research, these research questions around how the city was marketing jazz heritage and given the legacy of displacement and Black displacement in the Fillmore, and talking with residents and business owners. And I remember walking into this, speaking with this business owner of a Black barbershop that had been there for like 40, 50 years. And he was like, all these students like you come into my shop asking me what happened. They all want to know what happened. He was like, but no one asks, why is it okay? Why was it okay to treat people that way? And for me, I during that project already felt very, I wasn't connected to an organization or, any kind of group that was working in the Fillmore. I felt like it didn't make sense working in isolation as a student, but that comment really stuck with me, and I've thought of it ever since as, my personal interest in working on research justice and research as a tool to really document injustice in the past and working to change that in the future and to work towards a more just world and through policy change specifically. And that project also personally for me really opened my eyes to everything that has gone wrong historically with urban planning and development in this country, and really the issue of displacement has been a personal, just something that has really motivated me to work on this issue and to really look at how it can be prevented in groups that are working to change that. So that was my personal kind of motivation towards research justice. But I think with this particular project, we can talk more, I guess, probably in other questions, but I think what was very important was starting off with, as Causa Justa, as the lead organization on this, spending a lot of time at the beginning getting to a shared understanding of definitions and assumptions around what gentrification means and what it means and how it's been experienced by community members who are living the reality of displacement, of gentrification. And we really started with those stories to then build our analysis and to find data and literature that really validates what communities already know. So I think that's something that was important at the start of this project.
I can jump in. So my biography and how that's influenced my research is that I really try not to do much research. I see myself as an ally. I'm a youth development specialist. I work with young people, and the privilege of being older, having a degree, having a driver's license, having a bank account, would just override any information they would come up with, any of the data that they had. And if anything, it would just be a crutch that they would just look to me for the answer. So I really do very little research. It's actually kind of odd to be here speaking about research that I don't do. I'm speaking on behalf of the youth that I work with. So that's one way. And if I have time to share a short story, that one of the places that we went to research was Treasure Island Job Corps. The young people that I work with wanted to learn what Treasure Island Job Corps was doing to create career opportunities for the youth. And we were sitting there doing an interview, and one of the youth asked a question about what was it like to stand in lunch lines. at Job Corps, and I had to bite my tongue. I really wanted to roll my eyes. Like, lunch lines, we're like, we come all this way to talk about lunch lines, but it just opened up so much information about a merit system that they had, about how the students really felt, and it was a wealth of information that I would have never known, I would have never gotten to, because I don't think about standing in lunch lines. So one of the things I do is as little research as possible and just try to make sure I create spaces for the young people I work with to do the research.
These are such big questions. Yeah, go ahead. No, please.
So Zoe's reference to the barbershop made me think that before I went to Greensboro, I knew that I needed at least one other partner, being, again, an older, white academic from UC Berkeley. I reached out to David Anderson Hooker, who is at the University of Georgia. So unfortunately, he's another academic, also another lawyer, but he is mostly a restorative justice practitioner, peacemaker. He's done racial reconciliation work around the world. He's a pastor, obviously African-American man. So we worked as a team. Because David could go into black barbershops and sit down and get his hair cut and have the kinds of discussions that I couldn't have. And I could go into parts of Greensboro and be accepted and have people trust me in a way that he couldn't. So, because I think trust is so much a part of this process. And hopefully in the process of research, you build up that trusting relationship. But in the beginning, I think it's important to be aware of how we are all perceived, and it's part of who we are.
So maybe a different view on the question. I always hear the kind of, and Bianca, no disrespect at all, but just I think like it's a, okay. So I think that personal positionality and who we are is very important, regardless. I think it's a valid question. I think it's a question that too often, especially, and this is my experience with both when I was kind of a student and then kind of working with other students. It's a question that I think after my organizing experience, I've come to think of it's a question that people overthink. Mm-hmm. And it's a very inwardly and internally focused question, and it can be very consuming, and can stop you in many cases from doing things that you really should be doing. Because I think that so while I agree with everything that everybody has said, I think it's important to kind of bring some perspective to this question from a political perspective to this question as well. So what I would say about the question of positionality is, one, the most important thing to me is you root your work and you root your research in community and in organization, right? Because what is the purpose? Towards what ends? For what use is the work serving? I think that's a way more important question. And people spoke to that, what and who is the work in service of? When you have clarity on that, I think a lot of things follow. Secondly, I think research is a tool for collective analysis and collective action, right? So we started the conversation and Bianca said, well, most of us who are here are not here for self-aggrandizement or self-promotion. The product is not to, either get us tenured or get us famous or get us Nobeled or whatever it is. But right, it's for good. It's for justice. It's for collective action. It's for making change, right? And then my experience is that if your work is rooted in community and organization and with impacted people specifically, they teach you everything you need to know about how your positionality is either helping or hurting the project, right? People will correct you. People will say, thanks for coming to the barbershop. But next time, send your friend. They tell you, they're like, I remember my first organizing, I don't know what possessed me, but the very first organizing I did, I was organizing homeless folks here in Berkeley. Every place I went, the first thing they said to me is, who are you? Berkeley student? I'm like, I'm working so hard not to look like a Berkeley student, but what do you look like a freaking Berkeley student, It's like, so I had to learn over time. This is, I think, true for all of us, right? So I think when we work with people mitigate. But my experience too is people overwhelmingly will appreciate if you bring something genuine, if you bring something real, if you bring something that's useful. I think my experience is people genuinely appreciate it. I mean, communities in need, neighborhoods in need, people recognize when something meaningful is being offered. And then people just correct you in all the ways that you are wrong and unhelpful and not that appropriate to do whatever it is that you think in your mind. This is a fantastic idea for me to interview so-and-so about such and such. And they just tell you. They're like, you're funny. You're full of it. Anyway, but yeah, so I think this is an important question, but I wanna just encourage folks, if that is your impediment, if that is your concern about what I can and cannot do out there, I just wanna say, like, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't say I can and cannot do this because of who I am. Just say, what do I need to learn in order to do this well? Because this is helpful and can contribute. So.
Melanie, did you want to add anything?
Gosh, these are such big questions. I'm like overwhelmed by by this. I think that is a really, really important thing that you just said. I think one great thing about when we do drift monitoring is that because the tool is in the hands of the person who's doing the monitoring directly, I think that in itself makes it a tool for empowerment, even though, they send their samples to PAN and I'm the one who analyzes the data. It is very much like this research partnership because I can't speak myself personally. I cannot speak to being in a frontline community, being exposed to pesticide drift. My father was and my grandfather was, but I can't say that for myself personally. And so that's what makes the power of people's personal stories in addition to data is so huge. And when I talk as a scientist, I've been trained to hedge everything and speak with, leaving lots of room for scientific uncertainty where the weight of the evidence might not exist. Of course, morally, from that perspective, I come from the perspective, like, let's ban it all. But if I speak as a scientist, it just wouldn't be credible for me to say that. But our spokespeople who are from the communities are like, let's ban it all. Like, so they have a lot of spirit, and I really admire that. So the partnership and having a mutual respect for what each person can, either person in the partnership can do is really important. So, thanks.
Thank you. I think one of the things in terms of the question that I liked, in a sense, is that it got us to think about those moments when we had to check ourselves. And then we also got oriented to where we should be looking. And so I think part of the way in which I'm coming to think about research justice is that it's beyond just being descriptive about what happened, but what were those structures of oppression and inequality that legitimize those as things that happen and maintain them so that happened, right? And so then the project becomes different. It becomes more of an interrogation of the political relationships that happen, right, in those kinds of experiences. And I think sometimes for some folks, when we think about biography and we think and we reflect on it, the work becomes a little bit different on what we're going to do to move past that. So like for myself in this context, as someone, as part of a community that was over-researched and underserved, I know I'm in a good about 3 dissertations at the University of Michigan. I'm sure I know I'm there. And so like for me, I think about that question of how can I see myself as not reproducing that, right? And but at the same time, understanding that's a tension I have to hold when I walk on this campus, right? So I just wanted to clarify that on the up and up. But I just want to move on because we're running short a little bit on time. But I think like one of the other kinds of conversations we wanted to have on this panel to think about the things that kind of we learned in the process that helped us to prioritize that relationship, right? Over just the immediate needs of any one entity, or even how that process allowed us to figure out what needed to be kind of at the front in terms of orienting the research towards something other than descriptive, like oriented towards a social justice aim. So folks could think about that, or even thinking about how the project itself lent it to enabling the organization or partnership to keep it going further.
So I guess I previously said that all my assumptions were wrong. So I had this research idea about how best to amplify people's voices. And the reality is they did not want their voices to be amplified. They did not want to do oral histories. What they wanted to do was, and they didn't want to talk about the impact of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Because the 1979 massacre there that gave rise to the commission was such a divisive incident in that community's history that they were sick of talking about it. And instead, what they wanted to do was just talk to me about all the things that hadn't worked in Greensboro, and did I have any ideas for things that might work. So the research plan essentially changed after about 4 months. It changed radically because the community changed it. This is just what you were talking about. The community said, it may be important for us to talk about the commission, but that's not what we want. That's not what we want to talk to you about. And the fact that I was this old white woman from UC Berkeley, the things that I thought were going to make a difference didn't make a difference. That as soon as they realized that what I wanted was to find out what that community needed, what they needed, they were happy to talk to me. And my idea that I had to partner with a local, a community organization, you can't just partnership in, right? The whole basis of Courage, well, they said, look, this community is so divided. We hate each other so much. Even those of us who are working, who are the social justice advocates, we don't much like each other, and we don't trust each other. So any organization that you partner up with is going to be, in some ways, pushing against other people. So you have to remain independent. We certainly can't get local funding because it all comes with strings. So again, all of the sort of basic principles of PAR were out the window. So what we had to do was something completely different. What we had to do was find those people in the community who were what we call boundary crossers or silo crossers, that were willing or had experience in working outside of their silos, who had actually built some trusting relationships, and figure out who those people were. And they weren't obviously the leaders in the community, or people acknowledged as leaders. They were leaders in their neighborhoods, but they weren't acknowledged as such. Figure out from all the different silos in Greensboro who those people were, and bring those people together to say, all right, can restorative justice principles be used to advance racial justice in this community? And that's the group, and the group has named itself the Counter Stories Group. talking about how they can develop a counter story of Greensboro as a community that comes together, not a community that is divided. The counter stories from the sit-in movement there, the lunchtime counters, and the fact that when you sit down at a counter with somebody, you find out what their stories are. So this is about people's stories. And now it has become an entirely different project from the way it started.
Awesome. Awesome. I think anyone can.
I can go. So the youth research that we worked on, it changed the priority of Alameda County and Public Health Initiative, the priority of our career pathway program by really focusing on job opportunities for young people while they're still in high school. We knew we wanted to do an internship program. We always had stipend internships. We definitely wanted to create pathways into higher education, community colleges. Those things are still happening. But what really we realized was important to the young people was that they needed jobs now. They needed jobs at 15, 16 years old, that we couldn't wait till they got out of college to hope that they had a career and a salary. We need to be giving them an income. And so that definitely shifted our perspective a little bit. Actually, a lot of it. So Alameda County Office of Education now has introduced a youth worker program. So when our students come in for internships, they're no longer just given a stipend or service hours. They're hired as youth workers through the county as kind of like an entry-level position to build upon. They can do other internships with other departments in Alameda County Office of Ed and hopefully in other county agencies. So that was one thing. We're still working on the pilot program for the career pathway program, but one thing that has happened in the immediate has been that shift towards youth employment.
Just real quick, if there are questions, note cards, if they could give them to Susan with the lovely scarf, just so we're getting that time. And then also, because we're talking about this right now, I'm just gonna say aloud the question the folks have before them of how perhaps the partnership, the research approach impacted or affected the researcher community impact, the intended impact, or even transformed it, or the organization's core mission, how maybe even expanded the nature of the work given what you found out.
In terms of our work with the Public Health Department, so from a community perspective, the work has to be kind of tactical, There are a lot of public agencies out there. We have a particular reason why we picked the Public Health Department to explore and push on a closer partnership with. The fact of the matter is it doesn't work to attempt to go and just kind of knock your head against a brick wall. And the reality is that by and large, the majority of public agencies function as an extremely large, very hard brick wall for organizations like ours. So it's actually not smart for us to, we have different ways of dealing and working with the brick walls. The Public Health Department represents an opening and a possibility for us, both because there are some internal conditions and some tendencies and orientation that has developed within the department itself that leaves it open and makes it open to us, right? So this is important to contextualize, I think, because, for those of us who are organizing, strategy is very critical, and there's a strategy that is expressed in the partnership here. So the strategy is that we've identified an opening, and because of the opening, we are moving to work closely. Some of how that looks like Zoe talked about. One is that on both sides, we have to see this as a partnership because just because there's opening, it doesn't mean that there's a tremendous amount of still challenge and barriers and negotiation that has to happen to make the work possible and make the work effective. But one thing is that over time, we understand that it is absolutely in our interest to intervene strong and hard in things that happen in the Public Health Department. So everything from when they have staffing changeovers to leadership shifts at the public health department, we feel like it's our business to get involved in those conversations, because it's absolutely our interest to maintain the character of the agency as one that is favorable, open, and available to community organizations and to community residents in the way that the public health department has. So I think that if, depending on your perspective, and I'm guessing Zoe's going to talk about from the agency perspective what that looks and feels like, but I think for those of us who are, if your role ends up being one whereby you need to move a public agency, I think firstly, that type of political assessment is one thing I would encourage. Secondly, I would then encourage the kind of thinking that actually makes it very clear that it's not a hands-off thing. When they, I read their stuff and I'm like, I'll call them up and I'll be like, what does it mean that you're hiring a new director of blah, 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 blah? I'm like, whose job is it now? So it's like we have to be really in close communication, because it's our agency, so. They just work for us.
I did feel like I worked for CJJC this last year. So I think, I just want to say, first of all, this is really fresh. Like, this report came out 3 weeks ago or something like that. Yeah. So I feel like we're very much still in the learning process right now of what we learned and what we are learning still. And one thing off the bat is that this is an incredibly timely issue right now, and very contentious, very vocal debate about gentrification and the ramifications for residents, racially, equity-wise, whose city is Oakland? What does displacement mean? Is it voluntary, involuntary? So I think what we realize is that the definitions are really, really important, and getting on the same page between our organizations and in the media. And also, I think that this is really the beginning. I guess that's what I'm realizing in terms of, this report came out as part of a very large public debate about how to stop displacement and gentrification and what that means and what some of the policy solutions might be. And I think that there's a lot of policy recommendations in this report that we are going to need to do more work together on and really figure out within our, how our agency can support moving forward a lot of the recommendations in this report. And lastly, I'll say this was definitely a learning opportunity an incredible learning opportunity, not just for myself, but for our leadership and for the health department, as an institution to dig into these issues that are huge, and also to really think, what does development mean? What should it mean? What should it look like? And to have community residents' voice really leading that vision, and to have Just Cause leading that definition as well. So there's a lot more work to do, and that's really what I'm focused on right now. So.
My bad, y'all. I have 2 questions here, and we have to kind of speed it up just because I guess lunch is coming, and we only have till 1 o'clock to the next panel. So I got 2 questions from the community, and so I'm probably going to ask them together, and I think they touch on themes that we kind of explore, but we can maybe do a little bit more dialogue about. So the first one is kind of specific to PAN. So Emily, in terms of democratizing science, so these kinds of tenets of research justice that we talked about in the opening, what does that look like in the context of science? Because often that's really irreconcilable, right? Science and justice, right? So that's a tension. Even thinking about the organizing strategy as helping move that along, this idea of democratizing science. And then the other question was specific for Dawn, but obviously others, in terms of how kind of the research process can be used as a way to challenge the public or dominant narrative about the origins of social problems. And so how you found that as part of within the project. So how you conducted and used research to understand the causes of a problem without simply accepting the assumptions about the causes. So those are the 2 questions from the community.
I think one of the biggest tensions that I keep on mulling over is how could I get, for instance, a community partner who's really engaged and who's collected good documentation. Is there a way for maybe me to train that person to be able to explain their data beyond, or in a way that's with more depth, the way a scientist would? And I think I'm not sure if there's a good answer to that, but I keep on thinking it over, like, is there a good way? Because where maybe a partner might trip up in explaining their data is how they could explain, for instance, to a health agency why the levels that we've, measured their pesticide that drifted into their home, why is that level relevant? Or how does that matter to their health in addition to the stories that they have, their personal stories? But that's just sort of something I think about a lot, but I don't know how to resolve that. I think it is huge that we have a tool that we can give people so that they are engaged in that. They spend a time commitment. They are personally committed to that work. And they also have their stories. So I've just started kind of being in a regulatory agency and work, like engaging with them. And you're in this funny position where you have lots of criticisms of the regulatory agency, but at the same time, the people within the agency are human beings. They frequently or do care very much about the environment, about human health, and yet they're in this place where they need to do their job and to maybe they're not advocates. It's not their job to be advocates necessarily. So I'll just tell a brief story. So I was just recently in a meeting with several people from a regulatory agency, and there was a partner we had who almost died or came close to having cardiac arrest from a pesticide exposure, and she was telling her story briefly in the meeting. And then there was someone from the Department of Health in that state who made a comment saying, well, I see you here now and you're fine. And she wasn't, I don't think her intention was at all to be dismissive, but it was totally dismissive, and it sounded terrible to me. I mean, I just was like kind of aghast, but it's a reminder as a science person to not try to comfort someone in that manner, because it's inappropriate, both dismissive of their experience, but also is not necessarily, they might think that you come from a position of authority. Like this woman from the agency is saying you're fine. She knows that her experience was traumatic, so she's not fine. And I think there just needs to be continued evolving discussions around science and how we present science, and also ways to bring more scientists, I think, into the folds in the nonprofit community, so that we can get people used to that position, being in that position to advocate, because it's not something that comes naturally, I think, to scientists. So.
Right on. To answer the question, how does research challenge the origins of social problems? I don't think it does. That's my opinion. I welcome and assume that there are other opinions. I don't think you can use research to challenge the origins of social problems. I think people who experience the systems of oppression, I think people who experience the impacts of those social problems are clear, or much more clear on the origins of those problems. So for example, and then to not make it so agitational and rhetorical, I'll give some actual concrete ways of why I just said what I said. So Zoe referenced the fact that we worked the last 7 years on foreclosures and how foreclosures are impacting working class communities of color. There is so little data that actually, when we went to work on this issue, there's almost no existent data that helps us argue, or in some cases even describe the problem that is literally happening to millions of people, right? So I would say, I said things like, because I'm not a researcher, right? So I'm the organizer, right? So I'm having a conversation with a researcher and I say, we need information on a neighborhood scale of property value changes over time, and I need it over 70 years. Doesn't exist. We need block level tracking of change of ownership of properties over same set time frame. Doesn't exist. And I even come from a organization and a method of work that is, and this is not like a prideful thing, but we have some level of depth in these issues. So even though I'm an organizer, I kind of know some of these questions to ask. Like I even know how to ask for some of what I think will prove the problem or start to get us to solutions. Most of the time, my experience is as someone who's asking for data, that data does not exist. The data to prove the problem that everybody knows and is experiencing does not exist. What do you do then? Much less the data that will actually help you start to talk about, and Mary Louise was saying this to me when we were having a little side conversation during the buzz thing. It's like, it doesn't exist. So how could we rely on research to do these things? Well, now, if research reorients and if we begin to track all kinds of data, if people actually go to community residents and organizers and say public institutions, universities, et cetera, start to come to us and say, what kind of data would you need? What should we start tracking? How can the census data be more helpful? Ask, and if those things start to change, I think there's a possibility that we get to the possibility that research can speak to and start to challenge the kind of origins of some of these problems. But that, for the most part, as someone working outside of research, it doesn't appear to me at this moment that actually. So when we create our own, when we create our own tools to track pesticide drift, when we create our own questions, when we do all of that, there's a possibility we can do that. But my experience is that as it's currently organized, it's not well set up. And then the last thing, to kind of build on what Emily was saying, I think that one of the tremendous contributions that folks in this room stand to make is to actually think a lot about how to share and make technical expertise and technical tools available to people who are actually experiencing whatever the social ills, social problems, social concerns that you're working on, because there's a range of them. Many people are very ready and able to tell their story, but sometimes people can be scientists. They can collect scientific data. People can, so I think one of the things that I would encourage folks to think about is how do we actually provide technical expertise so that folks are able to strengthen and add beyond the personal experience and the personal stories. How can people actually start to speak very technically to some of these things?
So I want to be more positive on an ending note, and I agree with most of what you're saying, but I think that research has tremendous potential to really expose the origins of many social problems. And just giving a very brief example, if you think about, again, the Greensboro Project, and you think about what neuroscience has told us about implicit bias, combining that, what we know from science about implicit bias, combining that with the stories of people in Greensboro, and then using the capital that institutions like this have, UC Berkeley, we can address the powers that be in Greensboro, which we did, about the origins of the divisions in that community. And we talked about implicit bias and scientific findings, and coming and using that capital so that gave it a legitimacy and gave a credibility to the voices of people in that community. That was not what those leaders wanted to hear, but they had to pay attention to it. And a lot of that was based in science. So I think I agree with you, but I also think research has tremendous potential.
So these are themes we hope you will continue on to the lunch and afternoon conversation, but we want to thank all our panelists for coming out and making themselves really vulnerable and keeping it real.